Everyone, welcome to the video lecture for Unit 2, Module 4.1.1, and this one we'll be talking about an introduction to the cardiac system and the anatomy of the heart. As always, here are your learning objectives. Make sure to pay attention to these when considering your lecture quiz as well as your unit exam. Let's jump into this. So in this module, we'll talk about the structure and function of the heart. This extraordinary organ beats approximately 100,000 times a day, and blood flows through a network of vessels that extend between the heart and peripheral tissues. Those blood vessels make up a pulmonary circuit, which carries blood to and from the gas exchange surface of the lungs, and a systemic circuit, which transports blood to and from the rest of the body. Each circuit begins and ends at the heart, and blood travels through these circuits in sequence. Thus, blood returning to the heart from the systemic circuit must complete the pulmonary circuit before re-entering the systemic circuit. Arteries, or efferent vessels, carry blood away from the heart, and veins, or afferent vessels, return blood to the heart. Microscopic thin-walled vessels, called capillaries, interconnect the smallest arteries and the smallest veins. Capillaries are called exchange vessels because their thin walls permit the exchange of nutrients, dissolved gases, and waste between the blood and surrounding tissues. Each day, the heart pumps about 8,000 liters of blood, enough to fill about 40 55-gallon drums, or about 8,800 quart-sized milk cartons. Try transferring a gallon of water by using the squeeze pump, and you'll appreciate just how hard the heart has to work to keep you alive. Despite its impressive workload, the heart is a small organ, about the size of a clenched fist. The heart has 4 muscular chambers, 2 associated with each circuit. The right atrium receives blood from the systemic circuit and passes it to the right ventricle, which then pumps blood into the pulmonary circuit. The left atrium collects blood from the pulmonary circuit and empties it into the left ventricle, which pumps blood into the systemic circuit. When the heart beats, the first atria contract, and then the ventricles contract. The 2 ventricles contract at the same time and inject equal volumes of blood into the pulmonary and systemic circuits. The heart is located near the anterior chest wall, directly posterior to the sternum. The great veins and arteries are connected to the superior end of the heart at its base. The base sits posterior to the sternum at the level of the third costal cartilage, centered about 1.2 centimeters to the left side. The inferior pointed tip of the heart is the apex. A typical adult heart measures approximately 12.5 centimeters from the base to the apex, which reaches the fifth intercostal space approximately 7.5 centimeters to the left of the midline. A mid-sagittal section of the trunk does not divide the heart into 2 equal halves. Note that 1, the center of the base lies slightly to the left of the midline, and 2, a line drawn between the center of the base and the apex points further to the left, and 3, the entire heart is rotated to the left around this line, so that the atrium and the right ventricle dominate an anterior view of the heart. The heart sits in the anterior position of the mediastinum. The mediastinum is the region between the 2 pleural cavities. It also contains the great vessels, the largest veins and arteries in the body, the thymus, the esophagus, and the trachea. The pericardial sac, or the fibrous pericardium, surrounds the heart. The pericardial sac consists of a dense network of collagen fibers. It stabilizes the position of the heart and associated vessels within the mediastinum. The lining of the pericardial cavity is called the pericardium. To visualize the relationship between the heart and the pericardial cavity, imagine pushing your fist toward the center of a large, partially inflated balloon. The balloon represents the pericardium, and your fist is the heart. Your wrist, where the balloon folds back on itself, corresponds to the base of the heart, where the great vessels are attached. The airspace inside the balloon corresponds to the pericardial cavity. The pericardium is lined by a delicate serous membrane that can be subdivided into 2 portions. The visceral pericardium, or the epicardium, covers and adheres closely to the outer surface of the heart. The parietal pericardium lines the inner surface of the tough pericardial sac surrounding the heart. The potential space between the parietal and visceral surfaces is the pericardial cavity. It normally contains about 15 to 50 milliliters of pericardial fluid, secreted by the pericardial membranes. This fluid acts as a lubricant, reducing friction between the opposing surfaces as the heart beats. Pathogens can infect the pericardium, producing inflammation and the condition called pericarditis. The inflamed pericardial surfaces rub against one another, making a distinctive scratching sound that can be heard through a stethoscope. The pericardial inflammation also commonly results in increased production of pericardial fluid. Fluid then collects in the pericardial cavity, restricting the movement of the heart. This condition, called cardiac tamponade, can also result from traumatic injuries, such as stab wounds, that produce bleeding into the pericardial cavity. You can easily identify the position of the heart within the rib cage and the 4 chambers of the heart in a superficial view. The 2 atria have relatively thin muscular walls and are highly expandable. When not filled with blood, the outer portion of each atrium deflates and becomes a lumpy, wrinkled flap. This expandable extension of an atrium is called an atrial appendage, or an auricle, because it reminded early anatomists of the external ear. The coronary sulcus, a deep groove, marks the border between the atria and the ventricles. The anterior interventricular sulcus and the posterior interventricular sulcus are shallower depressions that mark the boundary between the left and right ventricles. Substantial amounts of fat generally lie in the coronary and the interventricular sulci. In fresh or preserved hearts, this fat must be stripped away to expose the underlying grooves. These sulci also contain the arteries and veins that carry blood to and from the cardiac muscle. A section through the wall of the heart reveals three distinct layers: an outer epicardium, a middle myocardium, and an inner endocardium. So the epicardium is the visceral pericardium that covers the outer surface of the heart. This serous membrane consists of an exposed mesothelium and underlying layer of loose areolar connective tissue that is attached to the myocardium. The myocardium, or the muscular wall of the heart, forms the atria and the ventricles. This layer contains cardiac muscle tissue, blood vessels, and nerves. The myocardium consists of concentric layers of cardiac muscle tissue. The atrial myocardium contains muscle bundles that wrap around the atria and form figure eights that encircle the great vessels. Superior ventricular muscles wrap around both ventricles, and deeper muscle layers spiral around and between the ventricles towards the apex in a figure eight pattern. The endocardium covers the inner surfaces of the heart, including those of the heart valves. This simple squamous epithelia is continuous with the endothelium of the attached great vessels. As you should have noticed in AMP1, cardiac muscle cells are interconnected by intercalated discs. At an intercalated disc, the interlocking membranes of adjacent cells are held together by desmosomes and linked by gap junctions. Intercalated discs transfer the force of contraction from cell to cell and propagate action potentials. Table 20-1 provides a quick review of the structural and functional differences between cardiac muscle cells and skeletal muscle fibers, which you can see on the next slide. In addition, histological characteristics that distinguish cardiac muscle cells from skeletal muscle fibers include 1. They're smaller in size, 2. A single centrally located nucleus, 3. Branching interconnections between cells, and 4. The presence of intercalated discs. Next, let's examine the major landmarks and structures visible on the interior surface of the heart. In sectional view, you can see that the right atrium communicates with the right ventricle, and the left atrium with the left ventricle. The atria are separated by the intraatrial septum, which is just a wall, and the ventricles are separated by the much thicker interventricular septum. Each septum is a muscular partition. Atrioventricular valves, or AV valves, are folds of fibrous tissues that extend into the openings between the atria and the ventricles. These valves permit blood to flow only in one direction, from the atria to the ventricles. The right atrium receives blood from the systemic circuit to the two great veins, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. The superior vena cava opens up into the posterior and superior portion of the right atrium, and it delivers blood to the right atrium from the neck, the head, the upper limbs, and the chest. The inferior vena cava opens into the posterior and inferior portions of the right atrium, and it carries blood to the right atrium from the rest of the trunk, the viscera, and the lower limbs. The cardiac veins draining the myocardium return blood to the coronary sinus, a large thin-walled vein that opens up into the right atrium inferior to the connection with the superior vena cava. The opening of the coronary sinuses lies near the posterior edge of the intraatrial septum. From about the 5th week of embryonic development until birth, an oval opening called the foramen ovale penetrates the intraatrial septum and connects the two atria of the fetal heart. Before birth, the foramen ovale permits blood to flow from the right atrium to the left atrium, while the lungs are developing. At birth, the foramen ovale closes and the opening is permanently sealed off within 3 months of delivery. Small, shallow depressions called the fossa ovalis remain at this site in the adult heart. In contrast, the anterior atrial wall and the inner surface of the auricle contain prominent muscular ridges called the pennectate muscles, or the musculi pectinati. Blood travels from the right atrium to the right ventricle to a broad opening bordered by 3 fibrous flaps. These flaps, called cusps, are part of the right atrioventricular, or AV valve, also known as the tricuspid valve. The free edge of each cusp is attached to connective tissue fibers called chordae tendineae. The fibers originate at the papillary muscles, the conical muscular portions that arise from the inner surface of the right ventricle. The right AV valve closes when the right ventricle contracts, preventing the backflow of blood into the right atrium. Without the chordae tendineae to anchor their free edges, the cusps would be swinging like doors that permit blood flow in both directions. The internal surface of the ventricle also contains a series of muscular ridges, the trabeculae carneae. The moderator band is a muscular ridge that extends horizontally from the inferior portion of the interventricular septum and connects to the anterior papillary muscle. This ridge contains a part of the conducting system, an internal network that coordinates the contractions of cardiac muscle cells. The moderator band delivers the stimulus for contraction to the papillary muscles. As a result, they begin tensing the chordae tendineae before the rest of the ventricle contracts. The superior end of the right ventricle tapers into the cornus arteriosus, a cone-shaped pouch that ends at the pulmonary valve, or the pulmonary semilunar valve. The pulmonary valve consists of 3 semilunar cusps of the thick connective tissue. Blood flowing from the right ventricle passes through this valve into the pulmonary trunk and the start of the pulmonary circuit. The cusps prevent backflow as the right ventricle relaxes. Once in the pulmonary trunk, blood flows into the left pulmonary arteries and the right pulmonary arteries. These vessels branch repeatedly within the lungs before supplying the capillaries where gas exchange occurs. From the respiratory capillaries, blood collects into small veins that ultimately unite to form the 4 pulmonary veins. The posterior wall of the left atrium receives blood from 2 left and 2 right pulmonary veins. Like the right atrium, the left atrium has an auricle. A valve, the left atrioventricular valve, or bicuspid valve, guards the entrance to the left ventricle. As the name bicuspid implies, the left AV valve contains 2 cusps, not 3. And clinicians also call this valve the mitral valve. The left AV valve permits blood to flow from the left atrium into the left ventricle, but it prevents backflow when the left ventricle contracts. Even though the 2 ventricles hold and pump equal amounts of blood, the left ventricle is much larger than the right ventricle. Why? And the simple answer is that it has thicker walls. These thick muscular walls enable the left ventricle to push blood through the larger systemic circuit. In contrast, the right ventricle needs to pump blood at a lower pressure, only about 15 centimeters to and from the lungs. The internal organization of the left ventricle resembles that of the right ventricle, but it has no moderator band. The trabeculae carneae are prominent. A pair of large papillary muscles tenses the chordae tendineae that anchor the cuffs of the AV valve and prevent blood from flowing back into the left atrium. Blood leaves the left ventricle through the aortic valve or the aortic semilunar valve and goes into the ascending aorta. The arrangement of cusps in the aortic valve is the same as that in the pulmonary valve. Once the blood has been pumped out of the heart and into the systemic circuit, the aortic valve prevents backflow into the left ventricle. From the ascending aorta, blood flows to the aortic arch and into the descending aorta. The pulmonary trunk is attached to the aortic arch by the ligamentum arteriosum, a fibrous band left over from an important fetal blood vessel that once linked the pulmonary and systemic circuits. The function of the atria is to collect blood that is returned to the heart and convey it to the ventricles. The demands on the right and left atria are similar, and the 2 chambers look almost identical. The demands on the right and left ventricles, however, are very different, and the 2 have significant structural differences. Anatomical differences between the left and right ventricles are easiest to see in a 3-dimensional view. The lungs are close to the heart, and the pulmonary blood vessels are relatively short and wide. For these reasons, the right ventricle normally does not need to work very hard to push blood through the pulmonary circuit. Accordingly, the muscular wall of the right ventricle is relatively thin. In sectional view, it resembles a pouch attached to the massive wall of the left ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, it acts like a bellows, squeezing the blood against the thick wall of the left ventricle. This action moves blood very efficiently with minimal effort, but it develops at relatively low pressures. A comparable pumping arrangement would not work well for the left ventricle. 4 to 6 times as much pressure must be exerted to push through the systemic circuit as through the pulmonary circuit. The left ventricle has an extremely thick muscular wall and is round in cross-section. When this ventricle contracts, it shortens and narrows. In other words, 1, the distance between the base and the apex decreases, and 2, the diameter of the ventricular chamber decreases. The effect is similar to simultaneously squeezing and rolling up the end of a toothpaste tube. The pressure generated is more than enough to open the aortic valve and eject blood into the ascending aorta. As the powerful left ventricle contracts, it bulges into the right ventricular cavity. This action makes the right ventricle more efficient. Individuals with severe damage to the right ventricle may survive because the contraction of the left ventricle helps push blood into the pulmonary circuit. As we've seen, the heart has 2 pairs of one-way valves that prevent backflow of blood as the chambers contract. Let's look at the structure and function of these heart valves. The AV valves prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricles to the atria when the ventricles are contracting. The chordae tendineae and papillary muscles play an important role in normal function of the AV valves. When the ventricles are relaxed, the chordae tendineae are loose, and the AV valves offer no resistance as blood flows from the atria into the ventricles. When the ventricles contract, blood moving back towards the atria swings the cusps together, closing the valves. At the same time, the contraction of the papillary muscles tenses the chordae tendineae, stopping the cusps before they swing into the atria. If the chordae tendineae were cut or the papillary muscles were damaged, backflow, called regurgitation, of blood into the atria would occur each time the ventricle contracted. The pulmonary and aortic valves prevent the backflow of blood from the pulmonary trunk into the aorta into the right and left ventricles, respectively. Unlike the AV valves, the semilunar valves do not need muscular braces, because the arterial walls do not contract and the relative positions of the cusps are stable. When the semilunar valve closes, the three symmetrical cusps support one another like the legs of a tripod. Adjacent to each cusp of the aortic valve are sac-like expansions at the base of the ascending aorta. These sacs, called aortic sinuses, prevent the individual cusps from sticking to the wall of the aorta when the valve opens. The right and left coronary arteries, which deliver blood to the myocardium, originate at the right and left aortic sinuses. The posterior aortic sinus does not give rise to any blood vessel. Serious valve problems can interfere with the working of the heart. If valve function deteriorates to the point at which the heart cannot maintain adequate circulatory flow, symptoms of valvular heart disease, or VHD, appear. Congenital malformations may be responsible, but in many cases the condition develops after carditis, and an inflammation of the heart occurs. One important cause of carditis is rheumatic fever, an inflammatory autoimmune response to an infection by streptococcal bacteria. It occurs most common in children. The connective tissues of the heart include large numbers of collagen and elastic fibers. Each cardiac muscle cell is wrapped in a strong but elastic sheath. Adjacent cells are tied together by fibrous crosslinks or struts. These fibers are, in turn, interwoven into sheets that separate the superficial and deep muscle layers. The connective tissue fibers, 1, provide physical support for the cardiac muscle fibers, blood vessels, and nerves of the myocardium. 2, they help distribute the forces of contraction. 3, they add strength and prevent overexpansion of the heart. And 4, they provide elasticity that helps return the heart to its original size and shape after a contraction. The cardiac skeleton, sometimes called the fibrous skeleton, of the heart consists of 4 dense bands of tough elastic tissue that encircle the heart valves and the bases of the pulmonary trunk and aorta. These bands stabilize the position of the heart valves and ventricular muscle cells. They also electrically insulate the ventricular cells from the atrial cells. The heart works continuously, so cardiac muscles need reliable supplies of oxygen and nutrients. A great volume of blood flows through the chambers of the heart, but the myocardium has its own separate blood supply. The coronary circulation supplies blood to the muscle tissues of the heart. During maximum exertion, the heart's demand for oxygen rises considerably. The blood flow into the myocardium may then increase to 9 times that of resting levels. The coronary circulation includes an extensive network of coronary blood vessels. The left and right coronary arteries originate at the base of the ascending aorta, at the aortic sinuses. Blood pressure here is at its highest in the systemic circuit. Each time the left ventricle contracts, it forces blood into the aorta. The arrival of this blood at high pressure stretches the elastic walls of the aorta. When the left ventricle relaxes, blood no longer flows into the aorta. Pressure declines, and the walls of the aorta recoil. This recoil, called elastic rebound, pushes blood both forward into the systemic circuit and backwards through the left and right aortic sinuses, and then into the respective coronary arteries. In this way, the combination of elevated blood pressure and elastic rebound ensures a continuous flow of blood to meet the demands of active cardiac muscle tissue. Yet, myocardial blood flow is not necessarily steady. It peaks while the heart muscle is relaxed and almost ceases when it contracts. The right coronary artery follows the coronary sulcus around the heart, and it supplies blood to 1, the right atrium, 2, portions of both ventricles, and 3, portions of the conducting system of the heart, including the SA node and the AV node. The cells of these nodes are essential to establishing the normal heart rate, and we'll focus on them in a later section. Inferior to the right atrium, the right coronary artery generally gives rise to 1 or more marginal arteries, which extend across the surface of the right ventricle. The right coronary artery then continues across the posterior surface of the heart. It supplies the posterior interventricular artery or posterior descending artery, which runs towards the apex within the posterior interventricular sulcus. The posterior interventricular artery supplies blood to the interventricular septum and the adjacent portion of the ventricles. The left coronary artery supplies blood to the left ventricle, left atrium, and the interventricular septum. As it reaches the anterior surface of the heart, it gives rise to a circumflex branch and an anterior interventricular branch. The circumflex artery curves around the coronary sulcus. It eventually meets and fuses with small branches of the right coronary artery. The much larger anterior interventricular artery, or the left anterior descending artery, LAD, swings around the pulmonary trunk and runs along the surface within the anterior interventricular sulcus. The anterior interventricular artery supplies small tributaries continuous with those of the posterior interventricular artery. Such interconnections between arteries are called arterial anastosomes. Because the arteries are interconnected in this way, the blood supply to the cardiac muscle remains relatively constant despite pressure fluctuations in the left and right coronary arteries as the heart beats. The great cardiac vein begins on the anterior surface of the ventricles, along the interventricular sulcus. This vein drains blood from the region supplied by the anterior interventricular artery, a branch of the left coronary artery. The great cardiac vein reaches the level of the atria and then curves around the left side of the heart within the coronary sulcus. The vein empties into the coronary sinus, which lies in the posterior portion of the coronary sulcus. The coronary sinus opens into the right atrium near the base of the inferior vena cava. Other cardiac veins empty into the great cardiac vein or the coronary sinus. These veins include 1. The posterior cardiac vein, draining the area served by the circumflex artery; 2. The middle cardiac vein, draining the area supplied by the posterior interventricular artery; and 3. The small cardiac vein, which receives blood from the posterior surfaces of the right atrium and ventricle. The anterior cardiac veins, which drain the anterior surface of the right ventricle, empty directly into the right atrium, and coronary artery disease is characterized by interrupted blood flow to the myocardium. We'll talk a little bit more about some coronary artery disease and effects of that in Module 4.1.2.